and welcome to the Intertek In Trade podcast. My name is Thomas Andrews, and I'm the Intertek Government Services Global Sales Director for Business to Government. And I have the pleasure to introduce today our Intertek In Trade podcast, where we discuss the trends shaping global trade and market access. And today we'll be looking at how businesses can stay competitive and compliant as trade rules continue to evolve. I'm delighted to be joined by the UK Trade Commissioner for Africa, Mr. John Humphreys, who is the British government's most senior trade official within Africa, who is responsible for leading export promotion, inward and outward investment and trade policy in Africa on behalf of the Department of Business and Trade, DBT. Welcome, John. So, AFCFTA is often called a game changer. How do you see that this is going to help drive trade between the UK and Africa? And where do you see the present gaps, particularly in space of quality assurance infrastructure?
So if you think about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, or actually firstly start and think about Africa, it's not just one market at the moment, it's 54 different markets, all of whom have got different standards, different tariff regimes, customs arrangements and all that. So if you want to export into that marketplace, and you want to do business within the market, you've got to somehow deal with the complexity of all of that. So the real promise of the AFCFTA is basically to bring all of that together, to harmonise standards, to harmonise the way things are done, and really, if you like, remove a lot of the friction from within the market, and that will drive trade. I mean, there's an interesting statistic actually that the level of intra-African trade or intra-regional trade in Africa is much lower than other regions, and that's really the promise that the AFCFTA, is set up to address, if you like.
Thank you for that insight, John. It is clear that there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes with all stakeholders. So in terms of the identified gaps, how is the UK presently working with Africa through the framework of AFCFTA to close those gaps?
Well, Thomas, I guess there are two main strands of work. One is to actually support the AFCFTA Secretariat themselves, of course, which is a relatively small organisation with a huge task. So any sort of technical assistance and capacity building that we can provide helps them to move that programme along perhaps more quickly than they might be able to. The other thing, of course, is to look very much at how we work with businesses as well, because the AFCFTA is already coming to life through things like the Guided Trade Initiative. So what we can do there is support British businesses, particularly those that are manufacturing here, but want to export elsewhere in Africa, to guide their way through that. And we've been producing a series of guides to sort of help that. They're currently in progress and will be published fairly soon. The other thing is really if you think about the patchwork quilt of Africa and all of the different assessment bodies and all of the different standards and everything else, a key element really is looking at how do we get mutual recognition of assurance bodies, how do we make sure that if I get something certified here, it's recognised there, and that forms then a big part of the work, because all of this is really about reducing the friction of trade, which makes the market a bigger single market, makes it more homogenous, which then drives more trade.
Yeah, no, quite clear. Look, providing the opportunity for Africa to really leverage off AFCFTA is critical for economic growth and for the prosperity of Africa. As we work through those initiatives, as you highlighted there, how do you see that the supporting provided to help secure supply chains and to facilitate trade can be achieved through better quality assurance?
So I think if you think about why we have standards and why we have quality assurance, it's all about confidence, really. It's about the confidence to do business. I buy this product, I know that it conforms to certain safety standards, I'm comfortable that it sort of, is not going to cause harm for my customers in turn or for me. It's all about creating that sort of, I suppose, sense of trust, really, effectively. And at the end of the day, that's what we're really trying to do, to create a sense of trust, some commonality of standards, commonality of approach, which then means that trade flourishes. And actually, intra-regional trade within Africa is very, very low. I mean, my particular focus is actually outward from the UK, but actually it's a mutual benefit for all of us. But I think you can break that down then into all of the different, I mean, think about safety standards, think about food standards, think about, so it's actually, it's quite easy to say at a high level, but then when you break it down, it becomes very, very detailed, very, very quickly.
Yeah, when you talk about that there, it's quite clear that, you know, there are opportunities for Africa to align to both UK standards and to international norms.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think, you know, that is I mean, you know, that's what we're sort of aiming for really at the end of the day, to make sure that there's as much alignment as possible. Clearly, markets are different. They have their own priorities. You know, the environment here is very different than it is, let's say, in the UK. So there'll naturally be some differences in standards. And of course, countries have different approaches. But the more that we can standardise that, the better. And the UK is really sort of trying to lean into that. And we can lean into it in a number of different ways. So there's the African Organisation for Standardisation, previously known as ARSO. So really sort of supporting them, if you like, and trying to help them and guide them into that sort of international standardisation process. We've obviously got our own regulators in the UK, like the Office for Product Safety and Standards. And actually a lot of those bodies as well do work with other regulatory bodies. I mean, not just with the AFCFTA, but also with individual national bodies. So for example, you know, work going on between the UK's medical health regulator and the health regulators here where we are in South Africa. So this is the type of collaboration that creates that sort of framework for business, which is government's job really at the end of the day.
Fantastic, John. When we look at removing technical barriers to trade and how we can enhance regulatory cooperation, such as with organisations like ARSO, how can the UK support such organisations like ARSO with developing home standards that reflect the local realities on the ground and also still allow exporters to access such markets as the UK?
Yeah, so I think, you know, if you think about why we have regulatory standards, it's all about, you know, protecting consumers. It's about making sure products are reliable, that they're sort of fit for purpose. So you need to have regulation, and that regulation needs to reflect local realities. You know, the climate here is very different than it is in the UK. That will affect, I don't know, electronics products and things like that. And the same is true of almost every other sector. So you've got to have standardization, you've got to have regulation. You know, that creates trust in the market, and trust is of course what drives and facilitates business. If I know this product is safe, then I'm happy to buy it, and I'm happy perhaps to use it in my work or perhaps to sell it to somebody else. So regulation, standardization is very important within in a national context. But then internationally, if you've got a patchwork quilt that's very, very different, then that creates friction for businesses. It makes it more expensive. I've now got to go to 54, in the case of Africa, different standards bodies in order to, you know, get my products approved before I can export into that market. And each one of those things effectively becomes a friction, becomes a cost, becomes a disincentive to doing business. So what we need to do is we need to have local regulation, local standards, but then wherever possible, we want to try and align those internationally. And that's really where bodies like, you know, what was formerly called ARSO, the African Organisation for Standardisation come in. It's where the international standards bodies come in as well. It's where UK and local regulators come in as well, and bringing those together. So for example, in the UK, we have the Office for Product Safety and Standardisation, and they're having a conference coming up in the not too distant future in 2026, and really sort of bringing bodies together to try and sort of create harmonisation, to try and identify the areas where there's commonality, look for the areas of difference, and then try to minimise those. And all of the time, what we're trying to do is create the maximum possible opportunity for all of our businesses.
Great. We look forward to hearing more about the progress with OPSS in 2026, and hopefully Africa can actually collaborate with that, which would be really, really important. Well, as we look forward to the great trade opportunities for Africa from AFCFTA and how we see the UK and Africa trade corridor expanding, Where do you see the biggest challenges and where do you see the biggest opportunities?
Well, the biggest challenge is really the fragmentation of Africa, really, in a way. And we talk about Africa in a generality, but we're actually talking about 54 different markets, as I've already mentioned. And each one of those markets is sovereign, has its own standards. But what that does is it makes it very difficult to do business. And actually, there's a really quite interesting statistic. The level of intra-regional trade in Africa is much lower than it is in other regions. And yet this is a region of 1.3 billion people. It's a growing middle class. Very large part of the world's agricultural potential, critical minerals, renewable energy potential, all of those sorts of things. So what we're doing here is we're actually talking about how do we effectively liberate that? And then that works both ways. So that's the big challenge in Africa. How do we do that? And that's the promise really of the AFCFTA, and that's why I think everybody's so excited to support it. But then of course, within an African context, there are lots of other challenges as well. Skills availability, power availability. Africa still has a huge sort of energy deficit, which of course impacts businesses. And then looking back the other way, the UK is the 6th largest economy in the world. It's a very large economy. We're a major agricultural importer. We're a major importer of actually a wide variety of things that Africa has. And one of the things that's been really interesting for me is how much our total trade with Africa has actually been growing over the last few years. My particular focus is on exports, but UK exports over the last 4 quarters grew by over 10% into the region. And one of the things that's quite nice is the balance of trade between Africa and the UK is actually pretty even, which actually suggests a healthy relationship.
How do you see quality assurance frameworks and capacity building being part of that?
Well, they're critical to that. When I was in business, and I've spent most of my career in business, a lot of that in manufacturing industries, manufacturing electronic products and exporting them around the world, it's always the standards. It's not the tariffs really. I mean, tariffs matter. We're in a world of a lot of change in tariffs, but fundamentally that was an economic question. The bigger question, the harder question was, what are the food safety standards in this particular market? What are the electrical standards in this particular? How do I label things? What are the particular customs regulations that I have to follow in this particular market? So actually, if you think about it, that infrastructure, the infrastructure that assessment bodies provide is vital to that. And you've got to have it locally as well. It's not just enough that you don't want to send everything off to a lab in the UK or a lab in Europe. You need to be able to do things locally, both in terms of local assessment for the local market, but also for the international market as well.
Thank you so much, John, for that insight.
Pleasure, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I will highlight one other thing though, if I may, because I haven't mentioned it previously, but the UK also has active programs, and this is really for your audience in Africa. The UK has what it calls its Developing Countries Trading Scheme, which is really about allowing tariff-free, quota-free access for the vast majority of African markets and African products into the UK marketplace. And I will mention a sort of technical feature of that, which may be of interest to your listeners, which is we have what are called rules of origin accumulation rules, which mean that you can actually build African supply chains. So get an input from one African country, add value to it in another, and then export it to the UK without losing that sort of tariff-free, quota-free access. And that's very much in line with the promise of the AFCFTA. And I sort of see, if you like, almost like we're sort of trying to do some of the things that the AFCFTA will get to, but try and facilitate some of those things now. And the other thing we do is we have a program called Growth Gateway, which is really aimed at trying to advise African exporters, how do they access the UK market? I mean, you'll know from your business, how complex it is. It's one thing to meet standards for, national standards, if you like, for going into a particular market. But actually the buyers themselves have standards. The buyers themselves have their own requirements. So actually it's not just enough to understand what the UK's, SPS standards are. You also have to know, what does Tesco's want, or what does Sainsbury's want? Those are the sort of practicalities that mean that companies can actually get into the market. And we have a program to try and help businesses to find their way into the market as well. So I think for all of us, the This is the framework of doing business. What you're doing, the work that we're doing in regulation, the work that we're doing in standards is all about, if you like, creating those guardrails. Guardrails that create trust, that create understanding and facilitate business. And the promise is of growing trade together. And there's clearly a huge amount of potential for that.
Thank you, John. This has truly been insightful. As you've highlighted, quality assurance is not just technical, it's strategic for unlocking the promise of AFCFTA and business, African and British alike, to thrive. Thank you for listening and join us next time for more in-trade conversations.